This is the UnShaw Podcast, the podcast about atheism, religion, and everything in between.
The animals went in two by two, hurrah, hurrah.
Good afternoon and welcome to the UnShaw Podcast.
Hurrah, the animals went.
This week's episode comes to you at the somewhat unorthodox time of a Monday afternoon. Not due to any creative malaise, I assure you, but for a very good reason. In the small town of Williamstown, Kentucky, there stands a colossal life-size replica of Noah's Ark, known as the Ark Encounter. Funded in part by generous tax incentives and built to biblical dimensions, it's one of the largest religious-themed attractions in the United States. Operated by the Christian apologetics group, Answers in Genesis, the Ark Encounter claims to offer a literal interpretation of the Genesis flood narrative, complete with animatronic animals, exhibits on animal kinds, and a strong endorsement of young Earth creationism. But not everyone is on board with this message, or the public money that's helped make it possible. Yesterday, a group of atheists, free thinkers, science advocates and critics of public funding for religious ventures gathered outside the Ark for the annual Ark Encounter Protest. Mark Alsip, friend of the podcast and all-round rationalist, joins me once again to unpack what happened, why it matters, and what this protest represents in the broader conversation about faith, science, and public accountability. And in the interest of balance, we'll be joined by another frequent contributor to the podcast, Nick Cowan. Mark, thanks for joining me this morning.
Good morning, or afternoon for you fellows, I believe. Good to be here.
So, Mark, tell us how it all went and tell us what the Ark Encounter Protest is all about.
Yeah, so probably start just with an overview of what it's all about, because I'm not sure a lot of people around the world are aware that this protest exists. Basically, what we had is a group of people who are concerned about separation of church and state. We feel as a group that theocracy is becoming a thing in America, that religion is creeping into education and politics, and it really should be kept separate. Our Constitution says so.
Okay, and how did the day go? Did you meet with much opposition?
There were some counter-protesters. We were warned in advance that they would be there, and I guess you could say you could hear some loud arguments breaking out as people engaged, but it's okay to exchange ideas peacefully. No violence broke out or anything like that. We were peaceful. They were peaceful for the most part, but a lot of anger.
We'll talk about the historicity of the Ark story. And in your book, Mark, Journey to Reason, you devote a couple of chapters, I believe, to debunking the story of Noah's Ark. So why did it not happen? What evidence can you give us to say that it's fiction?
Well, as we know in debate, if someone makes a claim, the burden of proof is on the person making the claim. And in this case, it's young Earth creationists saying there was an ark. So it's not necessarily up to me to disprove it. It's up to them to offer evidence. And I've seen no evidence. I do see evidence to the contrary. For example, if there was a global flood, you would expect a global refill with all the living creatures, everything on Earth at that point, all mixed up together on the fossil layer. And that just doesn't exist anywhere.
You talk in your book as well about the logistical issues of the Ark story as well. Can you tell us briefly about those?
Oh, yeah. Well, there wouldn't be enough room on the Ark for all the animals and the food. That shoots the story down right there. There are some apologetics. You don't find this in the Bible, but they say that they've gathered a bunch of baby animals, including dinosaurs and everything. They got a bunch of small things, and they have this very murky definition of something called a kind. They don't use the word species. So they lump cats and lions and mountain lions and tigers and leopards and cheetahs into the same kind and say that Noah only took one of those kinds. Well, where in the fossil record is there an evidence of a cat kind? What did it look like? Was it a little kitten with big lion fangs? It makes no sense. I think they estimate 1,700 different kinds, about the size of a sheep. And I ran the math on this. If you had that many pairs of sheep and basic daily consumption of food, it wouldn't all fit on the ark. It just doesn't fit. It's just not possible.
And at this juncture, we'll welcome our other guest to the show, Nick Cowan. Nick Cowan, good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon, Bob.
You're of the opinion that the story of Noah's Ark and the global flood is historical reality. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Like the rest of Scripture, it is God-breathed. And God inspired men, and possibly one woman who wrote the book of Hebrews, but God inspired people to write what he had purposed. The book of Jeremiah, for example, starts something like, God says to Jeremiah, what do you see? And he says, I see like an almond tree. And God says, you've seen correctly. I'm watching over my word to perform it. Now, remember, we're talking about God. We're talking about the supreme being, the creator of all things. He has the right to do what he wants. He doesn't have to conform to the laws of science that he himself formulated. Jesus Christ isn't just someone who appeared on the scene about 2,000 years ago. It says, by him all things were created. Before he was our Savior, he was our Creator. Before he preached a Sermon on the Mount, he made the mountain. Before he died on Calvary's tree, he made the tree. And so we're talking about God. I have faith in the historicity of Scripture. We get it wrong when we look at the Old Testament and say, well, the first 5 books are the law, the Pentateuch, and the next 12 books are the history books. But hang on, that's a false distinction. The first 5 books are just as much history.
How did God overcome the food issue? I guess you're saying that the animals didn't need food or...
Well, Jesus went 40 days in the wilderness without eating anything. We're talking about God. God can do whatever he wants.
Well, the problem you have there is that young earth creationists claim that this is science. They say that science supports this. They don't have any scientific evidence to support it. All they do is naysay science. They have no way of dating the earth. They have no way of studying geology. They have no explanation for anything except, oh, God did it. If God did this, why did he send a flood and drown a bunch of innocent little babies? God could have snapped his fingers and all the bad guys could have dropped dead. And why kill all those animals anyway? He created them in a moment on a day. Why go to all this trouble to build this boat when you could just snap your fingers and have it the way you want it? Why are you drowning babies and children? They claim this happened, and nobody's upset about it. I'm upset. I don't want my family being taught that. Where's the morality in drowning babies?
What if this life is just a temporary dwelling place, and there's something better beyond? Then it's not a tragedy if babies die.
Oh, that's horrifying. That's horrifying.
Do you pick flowers before they're fully mature?
See, this is what really gets me, is the young earth creationists claim to be on the moral high ground here. And I think about a little toddler laying there in a crib and the water slowly oozing up, getting into their nostrils and their mouth, and they're choking to death on the water and they're suffering. And they didn't do anything wrong. They don't even know what right and wrong is. But God killed them. He didn't have to do that. He made a conscious decision, if you believe in this story, this myth, to kill little babies. God did that.
They're quite clear about the circumstances in the world at that time. It says the wickedness of man was...
Were the babies wicked?
No, it doesn't define which people were wicked. I do believe that babies have an age of accountability. But
okay, we agree on that.
It says the earth was full of violence. It says then God decided to wipe out the whole creation apart from...
Here's an idea. Why not just wipe out all the violent people?
You need to ask all these questions. It's a judgment against the world, and God has the right. He is the creator. He has the right to judge the world, and he did. What's amazing is he then gave a sign that he would never do it again by putting a rainbow in the sky.
Well, he did do it again to a certain group. If you're familiar with the story of the Jewish people fleeing Egypt, God wiped out all the firstborn children in Egypt. There was no ark for the Jewish people there. He just made all the babies drop dead. And it's just horrifying to me to hand wave this away and cover it up. I'm hearing from all the young earth creationists I talk to that they're just fine with God killing those babies.
So, Nick, why couldn't God just have clicked his fingers and got rid of all of the wickedness in the world? Why drown babies?
I mean, there's always going to be a range of ages on the planet when God decides to do it. Why are we making babies? It's just an emotive argument, which I don't buy, I'm afraid. I mean, of course it's a tragedy when anybody dies.
God intentionally killed these babies, and he didn't have to. He didn't have to do any of that, but he did.
So, Nick, why couldn't God have clicked his fingers and effected the changes that he wanted to make?
He could have done, but he didn't. Who are we to argue against the Creator? It's his world.
That you're okay with him killing children.
I have to accept it. It's just a fact.
Hurrah! The animals went in 3 by 3, the wasp, the ant, and the bumblebee. And they all went into the ark for to get out of the rain.
Here's a question for you, Nick. If I was God and I wanted to start all over again, which is essentially what Noah's Ark is all about, I would affect that change in a way that involved less suffering. Does that make me more moral than God?
Well, you're your own God, so you might as well make the decision for yourself. All I can do is tell you what Scripture says and what God did. And that's what he did. If you want to call God to account, this whole book of the Bible, called Job, which you might like to read, at the end of the book, you get Job stating something like this. When he's finished trying to justify himself before God and quizzing God, God says, now listen, I've heard enough about you. You didn't listen to me ask you a few questions. And he has 77 questions of Job. And in the end, Job repents. He puts his hand in front of his mouth. I realize who I've been talking to. But he then says, before I'd heard about you, and now I know you. And I know that what you do is right. And then God blesses him towards the end of his life with twice as much as he ever had in the beginning. It's a remarkable story. We don't get anywhere by trying to pretend we're God and what would we do if we were God.
I have to disagree. I have read Job. I've read Job many times, and God tortured that poor man on purpose to test him. That's not the first time God tortured someone. If you're going to torture someone to force them to believe in you, a good parallel there is that we're told that if we don't follow Jesus, we're going to burn in hell. God doesn't have to send us to hell, just like he didn't have to kill those babies. He didn't have to have his son brutally slaughtered. God could have just said, hey guys, are you sorry? And we say, yeah, but God repeatedly kills and kills and kills. There's so much blood and slaughter. And for religion to say they have the moral high ground and just accept all that because, it's God, I could design a better God.
So, Nick, essentially your argument boils down to he's God, he can do what he wants.
Yes. The character of God, in my view, is unimpeachable. God is love. God is just. He is more than moral. Who are we to bring charges against the Almighty?
So if I was going to wipe out the world, I'd do it in a more loving way that involved less suffering.
It's a human argument, Bob. It's a human argument.
What do you mean by that?
If I was God, but you're not.
I know I'm not, and that's why I said if. It's a hypothetical. If I was God and I was all-loving, I would choose a better way of wiping out humanity and the rest of my creation.
Oh, gosh. Where do I start with this? We're judging God by human morality. Where does that morality derive itself? From whence does it come? It comes from our sinful minds. It comes from our fallible thoughts. It comes from our finite bodies, and not from the Creator himself. To me, it's absurd.
Well, we're judging God according to his own moral standards, aren't we? When God says, thou shalt not kill, and then he has Moses send his brother to a city to wipe out every man, woman, child, even the animals. And Aaron shows a little mercy and comes back with just the women and little boys. And God gets angry and Moses gets angry and he orders the slaughter of all those people. This is your loving God. They slaughtered all of them except for the little girls. What do you think they kept those little girls around for? I hear you say it's about love and understanding, and I think about people being put to death at the sword or drowning, but you're saying it's a loving God. That's not love.
I remember seeing a meme, Nick, and it was the death count of both God and Satan. And it was something like Satan kills 5 or 6 people in the whole of the Bible and God hundreds of thousands. Does that make Satan more loving?
Well, of course not. Satan is a created being, a fallen angel. Satan isn't equal and opposite to God. That's not what the Bible teaches. Yes, Job was put to the test and suffered. In the end, he ended up with more than he lost. But yes, he was tough. But
Well, why? Why?
well, I don't know, because I'm not God. I don't try and pretend to be God. I don't say things like, if I was God, then. And that's not half of my vocabulary.
Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm not talking just about Nick now. I'm talking about Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity as I know it. People are happy to tell you every single thought God has. They will knock on your door, come in and sit down and spend hours telling you God's mind until it becomes inconvenient. And then all of a sudden we're like, oh, God's a mystery. Kind of a contradiction there, isn't there?
Well, Isaiah 55 is a very interesting phrase that says basically my thoughts and not your thoughts. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. It's just complete arrogance to try and pass judgment on God's morality. Morality derives from the nature of God. He is loving, he is just, but he will judge, he will punish.
Every time you say that, I think of the babies floating in the water.
The animals went in 4x4, the big hippopotamus stuck in the door. And they all went into the ark for to get out of the rain.
So when you get to heaven, Nick, and speak with Jesus, speak with God, would you potentially ask him what his logic was?
Okay, let me take you to a book in the Bible you probably don't know well, but it's the book of Habakkuk. And Habakkuk doesn't start by saying, Lord, you're magnificent, you're wonderful. He starts with, why are you making me look at evil all the time, God? You're not just. You're doing nothing about it. And God replies to him by saying, you're short-sighted. I'm actually going to raise up the Babylonians to judge my people, Judah. And Habakkuk, he says, but God, you can't do that because your eyes are too holy to look upon evil, which is not true, actually. God has to look upon every act of evil, every abortion, every assisted suicide. God has to look at those things. Habakkuk says, well, sit down now and see what God's going to say to me. I mean, Habakkuk showed regular faith. He was able to speak to him very directly, in probably a way I wouldn't. But in the end, God says, you just don't understand my ways.
Because he contradicts himself so often. Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46. You can take people of another nation to have as property and pass them down to your descendants. God says slavery is okay. You can't deny this. And yet, God didn't have time to ban slavery when he was banning killing and all these other things. This is the God we're worshiping, the logical God, the moral God. Is it okay to own people? Has it ever been okay to own people?
Again, this is very emotive word. We use the word slavery and it immediately conjures up something completely negative.
Well, it is.
Yeah, okay. But in the Bible, there is a class, a person called a bondservant. You could actually volunteer to be subject to a master.
Yeah.
Not a cruel one, not somebody with a whip. After 7 years, you could get your freedom.
Not if you were taken under the rules of Leviticus. No, you're talking about a completely different system. And I'm not saying that system didn't exist. I'm saying there was another system that did exist, and you guys are hand-waving it away. No moral God should ever make it okay to own another person.
They've only got their body to give. They can't give anything else other than their strength and their fitness.
That's forced slavery. I'm sorry. How does that make owning somebody okay?
Because it's voluntary.
So, Nick, are you saying that the types of servitude that God supports in the Old Testament, it was more like people were manservants as opposed to slaves?
Well, again, what's in a word? This is just semantics. We think slave equals bad. And so
It is.
Let's go to the New Testament. If you look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, something like verse 10, you see that in there's a list of people whom God says he doesn't really like what they do. And one is slave traders, those who do sell people. That is abusive. If you loved your master, you could actually go up, this is in Exodus 21, I think, you could go and say, I can be free now, master, but I'd rather stay with you.
Exodus is really interesting because that's where God gives instructions on the proper beating of slaves. You can beat them as much as you want as long as they don't die. Somewhere in Exodus 20, 21. That's how you could treat your slaves. You could beat them as long as you didn't kill them. And if you killed them, you might get a slap on the hand, but it's like to read this. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, members of the clan. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property. You can make them slaves for life. That's God speaking. Leviticus 25:44 through 46.
The animals went in 5 by 5 by hugging each other they kept alive. And they all went into the
So, Nick,
ark
if
to get out
the
of the
story of the Ark is historically accurate, wouldn't there be things that we would expect to see in the modern world that would confirm the story?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a monument I drove past back in England a few months ago, Stonehenge, and apparently there is no water damage on Stonehenge, and apparently Stonehenge was built before you guys say that the flood happened. Similarly with the pyramids, there is no evidence that they were submerged in water for any length of time. And Mark also talks in one of his books about the fact that there is no uniform fossil layer. There would be a fossil layer which contained every single type of animal, and we don't see that
Anywhere. Not one example.
Can I give you any obvious answer to that last question? What we do see, and it's me in the news recently, are fossil graveyards of many hundreds of the same species together. They're dinosaurs. Now, if you're a human being, you wouldn't choose to live next door to a dinosaur. So the odds of dinosaurs and humans being found in the same layer is quite remote. All these creatures were suddenly buried. They were quickly fossilized. And it can't happen over any more than a few hundred years. I mean, going back to the Ark, let me just quickly go on to the Ark. Just in the last 2 weeks, this feature in eastern Turkey, remote part of Turkey, near Mount Ararat. The Bible doesn't say Mount Ararat itself, it just says the mountains of Ararat. And they found this very strange geological feature that roughly shows the same dimensions as those given in the Bible, according to people who understand what a cubit is. So there is evidence. If you look for it, I don't need that corroboration. My faith doesn't depend on that. My faith depends on the God who I know and trust and love, as said in his word. That's what happened.
Well, it's good because it's not there. I would invite listeners to go back and listen to Nick's, I don't know if it's first or second appearance on this podcast, where he said that Bibles and humans did exist together, and there was evidence. You claimed very wrongly that Leviathan was a dinosaur in those times. Now, in the Bible, the Leviathan had multiple heads and breathed fire and smoke coming out of its nostrils. That's a fantasy creature. That's not a dinosaur. You also talked about Leviathans in the oceans. There were no dinosaurs ever in the oceans, ever. And as far as dinosaurs being found together in fossil layers, it's not a coincidence that they're all sorted by time. There are no dinosaur fossils in any layer anywhere contemporary with what we would call humans. They're separated by time, and you're a science teacher. I know you got to understand that there's just no evidence for this.
Nobody saw the event happen. An observation is the first principle we look for in the scientific method. You see people using in laboratories water moving to show how sediment gets sorted, yeah? Things don't always tend to be the deepest or necessarily the oldest. Sometimes the growth of a sediment layer is lateral rather than just one on top of the other. But if you look at the way the world is, for example, fossils are found all over the earth, which implies fossils are laid down by water. There are marine fossils at the top of Mount Everest. But you can't use science to confirm or deny anything, because nobody alive was there and nobody wrote things down and nobody recorded them. It's a matter of faith one way or the other. Scientists are people of great faith if they believe that the dating of millions, billions of years. It's just...
There's no faith whatsoever in that. It's pure, absolute science. Many converging layers of lines of evidence that support radiometric dating, for example, which you hinted to. I'd like to know, what scientific method do Christians have that shows the Earth is 6,000 years old? Not genealogies in the Bible, but how would you go about dating rock layers as a scientist?
Well, Professor Steve Taylor from Liverpool, he's the chair of electrical engineering and electronics. He's a fundamentalist Christian. I know that word will put you off, but he is doing some splendid work on aging dinosaur bones by looking at things like soft tissue, the existence of collagen, blood cells. Professor Taylor just had an article published in a secular science journal to do with dinosaur ages, ranging from 2,000 to 30,000 years old max. and he's got good evidence. And I'm sure he would be like me, fully supportive of the Ark Encounter, just because we have a right to say that the Bible is more significant to us in our everyday life than the school science textbook, which have changed so much in the last 50 years that I've been experiencing them. The science is shifting sand, but I want my feet on a solid rock, and that's what the Bible gives me.
The advantage that science has is that it can and does admit when it's wrong, and religion won't let you do that. Fundamentalists will never say that they're wrong about anything. So even if they were wrong, they'd still be telling you they're right.
So, Nick, when are you saying exactly that the flood happened? Is it around
2350 plus or minus 10 years? That's from Bible chronology. They've given all the names and dates if you want to have a look at them. The New Testament corroborates them. Jude writes that Enoch was the 7th from Adam. It fits in with Genesis 5. You could do all the work on the Bible if you want to. For a Christian, the Bible is more important than any science.
But he gets it wrong. And then you have people like me who know that it's wrong. And instead of them admitting, okay, we blew that one, we were wrong about that, they continue to insist on this idea of 6,000 years. It's worth noting that there are a lot of Christians who accept a 4.6 billion year old Earth, the 13.7 billion year old universe. There are a lot of scientists who are religious who believe that. I don't understand why people are so hung up on the 6,000 year thing. You have no evidence for it, but what's it matter?
Well, I don't like the word religion. It comes from a Latin word meaning to bind. I don't regard myself as a religious person, but I do believe the Bible is God's word. And the Bible is infallible. It's inspired text.
But I'm explaining as clearly as possible examples where it does fall apart. Could snakes talk? They don't have vocal cords. How did that snake talk?
We don't know. We don't know whether it was like human speech with a voice box.
But no speech at all. It was incapable. It spoke words, human words that Eve could actually understand. They can't talk. They don't have the brain structure to allow speech.
When Moses put ink to paper, he may not be quoting what we would regard as speak. It says the blood of Abel still speaks from the ground. That isn't just metaphor. It could be that it is God who's talking. For example, in the New Testament, you've got things like Jesus hearing a voice from heaven, but the crowd thought it thundered. Speech doesn't have to necessarily involve the same anatomy and physiology.
Well, you said every word of the Bible is true, and it literally says that the snake spoke. And then there was a donkey that talked and a burning bush that talked. If the Bible is saying those things are true, then
The blood of Abel speaks.
sure, I get that. That's a clever play on words. I don't have problems with that. But we have a snake that came up and spoke in whatever language that Eve spoke. I just can't believe in this day and age we're arguing about whether snakes can talk. What has happened?
Well, with God all things are possible, firstly. And secondly, we don't know what manner and what form the talking consisted of.
The animals went in 7 by 7. The little pig thought it was going to heaven. And they all went into the ark.
Mark, I understand that you talked in your book about the Grand Canyon. Nick, I'm guessing you're of the opinion that the Grand Canyon was caused by flood damage.
Yes. Above the ground lake, going towards the Rockies from Arizona, burst its banks, and the moving water, the huge volume of it, cut the canyon. And then the river, Colorado, flowed down as rivers do, the lowest point.
And you're saying that the Grand Canyon was created 4,000 years ago?
Ish.
Well, no. I mean, the Grand Canyon is evidence absolutely of not having a flood. There is nothing about the Grand Canyon that suggests flood. If you study geology, if you're familiar with the concept of an oxbow lake, slow moving water making these 90-degree turns, that's how we get this twisty thing that we see as a Grand Canyon. To have hit that rock with enough water to evaporate it would have left a straight line. I calculated once how many nuclear weapons it would take. You couldn't do it. It's 300 miles long, a mile wide, a mile deep, and you're going to need a lot of water to move that, and water moving at speeds that we can't imagine. The Grand Canyon being caused by flood, it's the exact opposite.
We don't know what happened in those days. There was nobody around.
But young Earth creationists claim to know exactly what happened. They go into great detail on exactly what happened. And again, I hate to keep beating a dead horse, but the way the Grand Canyon is shaped, it's very obvious that it was slow, meandering water And why aren't there Grand Canyons all over the world? Did God hate that one spot of land so much to blast that canyon out there? Why don't we have Grand Canyons everywhere if this flood was global?
Well, we do have geological evidence that's compatible with the flood from all over the world. I don't believe that the topography of the Earth's surface today is incompatible with the global flood mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 to 9. But if you look at the way the world is, for example, fossils are found all over the Earth, which implies fossils are laid down by water. The number of marine fossils at the top of the highest mountains. There are marine fossils at the top of Mount Everest. They can only come if the world was once inundated with water, as the Bible clearly says. The Earth was once covered by water.
Well, no, there are fossils on top of high mountains because at one point the rock was underwater and the only marine animals lived there. And because of plate tectonics, one plate that used to be an ocean gets shifted up. And that's why you find fossils on the top of mountains, marine fossils. They started out underwater, yeah, but why don't you find dinosaur fossils on the top of the mountains? Why do you only find marine animals in those layers?
No idea why they haven't found them up high mountains. I think they'll be there if they went to look for them. They may not have looked for them yet.
Oh, no, we have. I assure you we have.
The animals went in 8 by 8. The turtle thought he was coming late. And they all went into the
Well, I
ark
understand that,
for to
Mark.
get out of
The
rain.
protest is not really about the historicity or the morality of the story of Noah's Ark. It's protesting about the use of public money to build and subsidize the Ark. Is that right?
That is the main thrust, and that's what I spoke about. But there are a lot of us who are alarmed that children are being taught that these events were real. And yes, that's bad in the first place, but then we turn around and use taxpayer money. I've got a whole page of stats here. I don't know how many you want, but this goes against our Constitution, and that should be the end of the argument right there.
Okay, so presumably the separation of church and state is basically what you're saying, that government should not fund a particular religious viewpoint. Is that right?
Yes, and especially one that I think is detrimental to society when you have people who are being fed false information and we're helping to fund that. It's a pretty sharp sword with two sides and both of them cut. But that's why I protested, is because I don't want my tax dollars going to this.
Okay, well, how about if someone was to say to you that the Ark Encounter clearly attracts visitors from far away, so it brings revenue to the area, and governments fund tourist attractions all over the world? What's the difference? If it's an investment, then surely it's a good thing.
I wouldn't agree with that at all. There's no evidence that Williamstown has received any benefits from this at all. As a matter of fact, the people there come up on the short end of the stick. Just one quick example. There were people interviewed. They started a restaurant. This couple sunk their savings in a restaurant. And what happened at the Ark Encounter, they put their own restaurant on the property so you don't have to leave the Ark Encounter to go and eat. So you've got all these people in Williamstown expecting business, and also nobody stays in the area. I pointed out just an hour drive from each way. So nobody stays there. They come to the Ark Encounter and then they drive back to a big city where there's something to do. And they've been given so much. They get back $1.8 million a year from the state. They're paying the Ark, and the local people aren't getting anything out of it. There's no evidence. The numbers they claim. An acquaintance put a records request on the Ark since it opened, and they've never come close to the millions of annual visitors they promised. Nowhere close.
Okay, over to you, Nick. If you were an American citizen, would you be supportive of state money being used to fund and subsidize this attraction?
Well, I mean, I need to know a little bit about American history. I thought Thomas Jefferson, was he the second president? I can't remember. Didn't he use God in a lot of his writing? You know, in God we trust. I mean, I didn't know the American system quite as well. America's a democracy and Britain is a democracy. And we have the right to vote people in. If we don't like what they do, then we don't vote them in. Then we have to live by our choice. America's chosen to put a guy called Donald Trump, who is an extremely immoral man, not a good light for Christians to try and adopt.
We agree.
Having said that, the Republican Party is more likely to do things that will please Christians. But the whole thing about the restaurant owners nearby the Ark Encounter, I'm not saying it's just pure greed, but it's a bit speculative to think that Christians are going to bring in a lot of money. They don't.
I'm sorry, I have to correct you on that point. Christianity and religions bring in tons of money. The Catholic Church has close to, is it $100 billion in assets? The Mormon Church has assets in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I've been to some of these mega churches here. If that money was spent for real charity, oh my God, the churches are the sizes of arenas. They're rich, they're plush, and it's all tax-free. They get away with paying no taxes, and they're not even doing charity work with the money half the time.
How would you respond to that point, Mark, that the decision to fund, to subsidize the Ark Encounter was made by democratically elected politicians? People have voted in whomever to whatever state legislature. They have made the decision, as is their right to do, to fund this attraction. What's the problem?
The problem is the politicians that are elected still have to follow the law. And our law is very clear on this. Jefferson is a very interesting case. Jefferson was a deist. He wasn't a Christian. He believed Jesus was just a man who did good things. Jefferson believed in this so strongly, he edited his own Bible with a razor blade. He took different versions of the New Testament, cut out all the miracles of Jesus. Jefferson was definitely not trying to inject religion into the state. He believed himself, but he also believed in separation. He made that very clear.
So, Nick, the American Constitution, separation of church and state. The state should not fund religious activity. Who are you to say that the American people should not separate church and state?
Well, I'm not sure what the implication of the phrase is anyway. It rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Separation of church and state. What does that mean in practice? It seems to me that the Ark is self-funding to a degree. Is there no admission charge? Do people pay to get in, pay to park their car?
A lot of money, yes. Oh, yes.
Even if the state of Kentucky got off all support, if God wanted to fund it, it would be funded some other way.
Well, I'd be fine if it was funded some other way. That, again, is why I protested yesterday, because it isn't just our written law. Our Supreme Court has consistently ruled on the constitutionality of this. Separation of church and state isn't that hard of a concept, really. It means that the government will not endorse any religion. And what follows from that, according to our courts, is that we don't spend public funds on private religious beliefs. Who should we give the money to? The Mormons? The Baptists? Which one? That's why you don't put yourself in this mess to begin with.
Would you have an issue with the Ark Encounter being there if it was self-funded? Is the only objection you have to its existence due to the fact that public money goes into it?
That is my major objection. Probably 99% of what I'm objecting to is that, I believe that everyone should be able to worship however they choose for themselves. I think that, America got that right, but we shouldn't be funding it. I still do have issues with it because they do indoctrinate children. I was one of those indoctrinated children. We don't have time to go into it, but I talk in my book about what it's like growing up in that kind of rigid system where you're forced to believe things. So I do think there's some child abuse going on there. I think you're abusing children by doing this. I object to that also. But anyway, to answer your question, yeah, if it was not taxpayer funded, I wouldn't have a lot of say in the matter.
Because ultimately, if it was self-funded, it would just be an act of free religious worship and expression, would it not?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. To the extent, as long as it's not harming anyone. I do believe people are harmed, but that's a secondary objection. I keep repeating it, but I don't want my tax money going to this.
The animals went in 9 by 9, marching up in a long straight line. And they all went into the Ark for to get out of the
So, Nick,
rain.
we've talked about hypotheticals. Here's a hypothetical for you. Liverpool City Council decide that because there is a growing Muslim population in Liverpool, they're going to use your council tax to fund a museum or some other attraction that remembers the night flight to Jerusalem by Muhammad. What would be your reaction?
I wouldn't be pleased about it. I wouldn't be surprised in two-tier Keir Starmer's brave new world of the UK. I wouldn't be surprised. I would try and find a political party I would vote for, like Reform, who I voted for last time, who would oppose that sort of thing.
Would you say that it's unethical or discriminatory for them to do so?
Well, I'm already complaining about certain things that are happening in Britain at the moment under two-tier Keir, they call him, two-tier policing. You can have a pro-Palestinian march. If any Jew goes along and is attacked, they'll arrest the Jewish person because they're the cause of the problem, even though the aggressor is the Muslim, usually in a mob. I've got better things to do with my time. I just think yesterday's protest was a futile exercise, and I wouldn't be wasting my time on it.
So what would you think would be a better way for Mark to spend his time then?
For Mark to spend his time, I wouldn't presume on not to tell Mark how to spend his time. He's free to protest. I agree with him on free speech. But free speech has got to apply also in the school classroom. One person's education is another person's brainwashing or indoctrination.
I don't think I really heard a clear answer to Robert's question about would you object if they did an Islamic memorial with your tax dollars. I think you said you would not be happy about that.
Yes, I disapprove, but I just think I would never bother. If there'd been a similar Christian protest, I personally wouldn't have joined him.
You've just illustrated what happened in Iran, and look what's happened to them. I mean, it is hell on earth, especially for women in Iran. And why? Because not enough good people have stood up and said, we don't want religion injected into our government. You're on a slope. You're slipping down. And if you, one Islamic thing or one Buddhist thing, you're saying it's okay to keep doing that. And I don't see how that doesn't upset you. It would upset you if it was Islamic. If I could just give it a quick example, because we went through this here in Lexington. They wanted to build a mosque, and the city turned down permission. They would not let them build the mosque because it would supposedly cause traffic problems. Now, there are mega churches here. I drive by them sometimes on Sunday. They have police support. They bring out police cruisers to help with traffic management for these mega churches. If it's Christianity, it's okay. We don't care. We'll let you do whatever you want. But if it's another religion, you're out of luck. Non-Christians need not apply.
And that brings us to the end of our time together this afternoon, gents. Mark Alsip, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Robert and Nick, for agreeing to do this. I appreciate it.
And thanks, Nick, for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Bob, for your patience with us.
And they all went into the ark for to get out of the rain. And they all went into the ark for to get out of the rain. And they all went into the ark for to get out of the rain.